Venezuela chose the wrong U.S. carrier, and the world barely noticed how close we came to disaster. Let me take you back to April 20, 2024, a day that, on the surface, looked like just another routine military exercise in the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy's USS George Washington, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, was conducting what the Pentagon called routine operations in international waters off Venezuela's coast. Caracas, in response, scrambled a few of its aging Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, issued a strongly worded statement about imperialist provocations, and then, nothing. No shots fired. No escalation. Just another day in the long, grinding standoff between Washington and Caracas. Or so the story went. But here's what the mainstream media didn't tell you, and what most analysts either missed or deliberately: Venezuela didn't just pick any U.S. carrier to challenge that day. It picked the wrong one. And in doing so, it triggered a chain reaction of geopolitical miscalculations that could have easily spiraled into something far worse than a diplomatic spat. Something with real kinetic consequences. I've spent the last 3 decades studying crisis escalation, naval power projection, and the hidden mechanics of great power competition. And what I can tell you is the George Washington wasn't just another carrier. It was a trap, one that Venezuela walked right into, and one that the U.S. had been carefully setting for years. The fact that we're not talking about this more is a testament to how little most people understand about how modern warfare and coercive diplomacy actually work. So let's pull back the curtain. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Standard account, this was just another chapter in the long-running U.S.-Venezuela saga. The George Washington was in the region to support regional security, deter malign influence, and ensure freedom of navigation, the usual boilerplate language the Pentagon trots out whenever it wants to flex muscle without actually firing a shot. Venezuela, ever the defiant underdog, sent up its fighters as a show of force. The U.S. responded with a few F divided by a -18s, and both sides backed down before anything escalated. The media played it as a minor incident, if they covered it at all. CNN ran a brief segment with a retired admiral explaining how routine these operations are. The New York Times buried it in a paragraph about tensions in Latin America. The White House issued a statement reaffirming America's commitment to a free and open hemisphere, while the State Department warned Caracas against destabilizing actions. The data seemed to support the official line. The George Washington was, after all, just one carrier in a fleet of 11. Venezuela's military, though well armed by regional standards, was a shadow of its former self, plagued by brain drain, equipment shortages, and a collapsing economy. The U.S. had conducted similar operations dozens of times before, from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf, without incident. So why should this be any different? But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that both sides were operating with the same information. That Venezuela understood the stakes. That the U.S. was acting out of pure strategic necessity, rather than a carefully calculated game of coercion. And most dangerously, it assumes that the George Washington was just another ship. It wasn't. Deconstructing the hidden why Venezuela's move was a catastrophic miscalculation. Let's start with the basics. The USS George Washington wasn't just any carrier. It was the first Nimitz-class carrier to undergo a full midlife refueling and complex overhaul, a $2.5 billion, 4-year process that transformed it from a standard power projection platform into something far more lethal. Most carriers undergo RCOH to extend their service life, but the George Washington's upgrade wasn't just about longevity. It was about capability. Here's what the Pentagon didn't. 1. Stealth and electronic warfare upgrades. The George Washington was fitted with the latest /SLQ-326 electronic warfare suite, capable of jamming and deceiving enemy radar systems at ranges far beyond what Venezuela's aging Russian-made systems could handle. This wasn't just about defense, it was about denial. If Venezuela's Su-30s had tried to lock onto the carrier, they would have found themselves staring at a wall of electronic noise. 2. Next-gen air wing. The carrier wasn't just carrying F divided by a -18E divided by F Super Hornets. It had a full complement of EA-18G Growlers, electronic attack aircraft designed to blind enemy air defenses. And if that wasn't enough, it also had a detachment of F-35C Lightning IIs, the Navy's newest stealth fighter, which had never before been deployed in the Caribbean. These weren't just for show. They were a message: if Venezuela wanted to play hardball, the US could turn its airspace into a no-fly zone before Caracas even knew what hit them. 3. The silent Virginia-class submarines. Here's where it gets really interesting. The George Washington wasn't operating alone. It was escorted by at least 2 Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines, some of the quietest, most lethal underwater platforms in the world. These subs could have lurked undetected off Venezuela's coast, ready to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles at a moment's notice. And unlike the carrier, which is a big, slow target, these submarines could have struck with impunity. Now, let's talk about Venezuela's response. When its Su-30 scrambled, they weren't just intercepting a carrier, they were flying into a kill box. The US had pre-positioned AWACS aircraft, likely E-3 Sentries, to monitor the entire region. Every Venezuelan jet that took off was being tracked in real time. Every radar emission was being recorded. Every pilot's voice communication was being intercepted. And here's the US wanted Venezuela to scramble those jets. Why? Because it gave the Pentagon the perfect pretext to do something it had been itching to do for years: map Venezuela's entire air defense network. Every time a Venezuelan radar lit up, every time a missile battery went active, every time a command center transmitted an order, the US was collecting that data. And once you have that kind of intelligence, you don't just know where the enemy's defenses are, you know how to blind them. This wasn't just a show of force. It was a dress rehearsal for war. But Venezuela didn't see it that way. And that's where the real danger lies. The geopolitical why. This was never just about Venezuela. Let's out for a moment. Because this incident wasn't just about 2 countries posturing in the Caribbean. It was about something much: the slow-motion collapse of US unipolar dominance and the desperate measures Washington is taking to hold on to it. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can project power anywhere, anytime, without serious consequences. The Gulf War, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all of these were wars of choice, fought under the banner of liberal hegemony. The idea was if the US could shape the world in its image, it could prevent the rise of any peer competitor. But here's that strategy is failing. China is now the world's largest economy by some measures. Russia, despite sanctions, has rebuilt its military and is projecting power from Syria to Africa. Iran is a regional hegemon in the Middle East. And in Latin America, a new axis is forming, one that includes not just Venezuela, but also Nicaragua, Bolivia, and increasingly, Brazil under Lula. These aren't just random developments. They're the early stages of a multipolar world, where the US no longer calls all the shots. And that terrifies Washington. Which brings us back to Venezuela. Because Venezuela isn't just a thorn in America's side, it's a proxy battleground in the larger struggle between the US and its rivals. Russia has deep military ties with Caracas, supplying everything from fighter jets to air defense systems. China has invested billions in Venezuelan oil and infrastructure. And Iran? It's been quietly helping Venezuela develop its own drone and missile programs. So when the George Washington showed up off Venezuela's coast, it wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a signal to Russia, to China, to Iran. The message was: we can still project power anywhere we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. But here's the thing about: they only work if the other side believes them. And that's where Venezuela's miscalculation becomes so dangerous. The military why. This could have gone very wrong, very fast. Let me be: if Venezuela had actually tried to do something, if it had attempted to lock onto the George Washington with its radars, or if one of its pilots had gotten too aggressive, this could have escalated into a shooting war in minutes. Here's how it would have played. 1. The first electronic warfare. The moment a Venezuelan radar locked onto the carrier, the US would have activated its electronic warfare systems. The George Washington's SLQ-32 suite would have jammed the radar, while the EA-18G Growlers would have started emitting false signals, tricking Venezuela's air defenses into thinking they were under attack from multiple directions. 2. The second decapitation strikes. If Venezuela's military had tried to respond, the US would have launched a preemptive strike against its command and control nodes. Tomahawk missiles from the Virginia-class subs would have taken out radar sites, air defense batteries, and even the presidential palace in Caracas. Simultaneously, F-35Cs would have flown deep into Venezuelan airspace, striking military airfields before Venezuela's Su-30s could even take off. 3. The third no-fly zone enforcement. Within hours, the U.S. would have established air superiority. Any Venezuelan aircraft that tried to take off would have been shot down. Any attempt to move ground forces would have been met with airstrikes. And if Russia or China had tried to intervene? The U.S. had already pre-positioned B-2 stealth bombers in the region, ready to strike deep into Venezuela's interior. Now, some of you might be, but the U.S. wouldn't actually go to war over Venezuela. That's crazy. And you'd be right if this were 2010. But we're not in 2010 anymore. The U.S. is in a new Cold War, and in a Cold War, proxy conflicts aren't just possible, they're inevitable. Look at Ukraine. Look at Taiwan. Look at the South China Sea. The U.S. is already fighting a shadow war with Russia and China on multiple fronts. Venezuela is just the next battleground. And here's the scariest: neither side fully understands the risks. Venezuela's military leadership, isolated and desperate, might have believed their own propaganda that the U.S. was a paper tiger, that Russia would come to their aid, that China would provide enough economic support to keep them afloat. But that's not how great power politics works. Russia isn't going to risk a nuclear war over Venezuela. China isn't going to sacrifice its trade relationship with the U.S. for a country that can't even keep its lights on. And the U.S.? Well, the U.S. has a long history of underestimating its adversaries. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Every time, the hawks in Washington assume that a quick, decisive strike will solve everything. Every time, they're wrong. So when I say that Venezuela chose the wrong carrier, I don't just mean that the George Washington was a more capable ship than they realized. I mean that they misjudged the entire geopolitical moment. They thought this was still the 1990s, when the U.S. could be defied with impunity. They didn't realize that in 2024, every move they make is being watched, analyzed, and exploited by a superpower that is running out of time to reassert its dominance. The domestic political why this was never just about Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the U.S. domestic politics. Because here's the thing, this wasn't just a military operation. It was a political one. And if you want to understand why the George Washington was in the Caribbean in the first place, you have to look at what's happening inside the U.S., not just outside it. 2024 is an election year. And in an election year, foreign policy isn't just about strategy, it's about optics. The Biden administration, facing criticism from the right over its handling of the border, inflation, and global instability, needed a win. Something to show that America was still strong. Something to counter the narrative that the U.S. was in decline. And what better way to do that than by flexing muscle in America's own backyard? Venezuela has been a thorn in Washington's side for years. The Trump administration tried to overthrow Maduro with a failed coup in 2019. The Biden administration has maintained sanctions, but with little to show for it. So when the George Washington sailed into the Caribbean, it wasn't just about sending a message to Caracas. It was about sending a message to American voters: we're still in charge. But here's the when you mix military posturing with domestic politics, you get bad decisions. You get leaders who are more concerned with looking tough than with actual strategy. You get operations that are designed for cable news soundbites, not for long-term stability. And that's exactly what happened here. The George Washington deployment wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a campaign ad. And like most campaign ads, it was heavy on symbolism and light on substance. Scenario how this could still go horribly wrong. So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, Venezuela backs down completely. Maduro, realizing that he's in over his head, tones down his rhetoric, releases some political prisoners, and even allows limited U.S. oil commies back into the country in exchange for sanctions relief. The George Washington sails away, and both sides declare victory. Why? It's because Maduro's survival depends on his ability to portray himself as a revolutionary leader fighting U.S. imperialism. If he backs down now, he risks losing the support of his hardline base, and in Venezuela, that's a death sentence, politically if not literally. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. Venezuela doesn't back down, but it doesn't escalate either. Instead, it doubles down on its alliances with Russia, China, and Iran, seeking more military aid and economic support. The U.S. responds by tightening sanctions, conducting more routine carrier deployments, and maybe even greenlighting a covert operation to destabilize Maduro's government. This is the grinding stalemate scenario. Neither side wins, but neither side backs down. The risk? That one day, someone miscalculates. A Venezuelan pilot gets too aggressive. A U.S. drone strays into Venezuelan airspace. A Russian advisor gets killed in a strike. And suddenly, we're in a shooting war. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. Venezuela, desperate and cornered, decides to call Washington's bluff. It conducts a live-fire exercise near the George Washington, or it attempts to jam U.S. communications. The U.S., caught off guard but unwilling to back down, responds with a limited strike, maybe taking out a radar site, or sinking a Venezuelan patrol boat. Russia, seeing an opportunity to humiliate the U.S., sends a few military advisors to Venezuela. China, not wanting to be left out, offers economic support. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a quick, decisive operation turns into a quagmire. This is how wars start. Not with a bang, but with a miscalculation. The grand strategy why the U.S. is losing the long game. Let me be clear about the U.S. is not invincible. It hasn't been for a long time. For the last 30 years, Washington has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image through military force, economic coercion, and ideological pressure. But that strategy is failing. And the George Washington deployment is just the latest example of why. Here's the hard: the U.S. is trying to maintain a unipolar world in an era of multipolarity. It's trying to be the world's policeman when the world no longer wants a policeman. And every time it flexes its muscle, whether in Venezuela, Ukraine, or the South China Sea, it's not just projecting power. It's accelerating its own decline. Because here's what happens when your enemies get stronger, your allies get nervous, and your people get tired. Russia and China aren't just sitting back and taking it. They're building their own alliances, developing their own military capabilities, and waiting for the U.S. to make a mistake. And when that mistake comes, and it will come, they'll be ready. The George Washington incident is a perfect example. The U.S. thought it was sending a message. But what it was really doing was telegraphing its own desperation. Venezuela, Russia, and China all saw the same: a superpower that is still strong, but no longer invincible. And that's the most dangerous moment of all. What should happen? A realist's prescription. So what's the alternative? If the U.S. can't keep playing global policeman, what should it do instead? Here's my controversial: it's time for the U.S. to embrace a strategy of great power management, not hegemony. That 1. Diplomacy over coercion. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the fundamental mismatch between America's strategic ambitions and its actual capacity to enforce them. The George Washington incident wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of a much deeper problem. The U.S. military, for all its technological superiority, is stretched thinner than at any point since the end of the Cold War. And yet, Washington keeps acting as if it can still dictate outcomes in every corner of the globe. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. Navy, for instance, has been the backbone of American power projection for over a century. But today, it's facing a crisis of both quantity and quality. The fleet is shrinking down from nearly 600 ships in the 1980s to around 290 today, while its adversaries are extinct. China's Navy, for example, has grown from a coastal defense force into the world's largest naval fleet in just 2 decades. By 2030, Beijing is projected to have over 400 ships, many of them advanced destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. And unlike the US, which has to maintain a global presence, China can focus its forces in its own backyard, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the Western Pacific, where it holds the home field advantage. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still the strongest military power on paper, but it's no longer the dominant one in every theater. And when you factor in the erosion of America's industrial base, the fact that it takes years to build a new aircraft carrier while China can churn out warships at a fraction of the time and cost, the gap becomes even more alarming. The George Washington's deployment to Venezuela wasn't just a political miscalculation, it was a logistical one. The carrier was already overstretched, rotating between the Mediterranean and the Indo-Pacific, and suddenly it was being sent to the Caribbean on what amounted to a bluff. And when that bluff was called, the US had no good options left. Now, let's talk about the broader military implications. The US has spent decades perfecting a style of warfare built around overwhelming force, precision strikes, and rapid dominance. But what happens when your adversaries refuse to play by those rules? Russia's war in Ukraine has shown that modern conflicts are won as much by industrial capacity and asymmetric tactics as they are by high-tech weaponry. China, meanwhile, has spent the last 20 years developing anti-access/area denial capabilities, ballistic missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, and swarms of drones designed specifically to keep US carriers and air bases out of the Western Pacific. The Pentagon's own wargames have repeatedly shown that in a conflict over Taiwan, the US could lose 2 or more carriers in the first week. And yet, Washington keeps acting as if the old playbook still works. This brings me to the second pillar of my realist selective engagement over universal intervention. The US needs to stop pretending it can be everywhere at once. That doesn't mean isolationism, far from it. It means making hard choices about where American power is truly indispensable and where it's just a waste of resources. The Indo-Pacific? Absolutely. Europe? Yes, but with a much greater emphasis on burden sharing. The Middle East? Only where vital interests are directly threatened. Latin America? Only when there's a clear, achievable objective, not when some think tank in Washington decides it's time to send a message. Let me give you an example of what this looks like in practice. In 2011, the Obama administration intervened in Libya under the banner of the responsibility to protect. The result? A failed state, a refugee crisis that destabilized Europe, and a power vacuum that Russia and Turkey have since filled. Compare that to the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from Syria in 2019, a move that was widely criticized at the time but has since been vindicated by the fact that the US is no longer bogged down in an unwinnable conflict. The lesson? When the US intervenes without a clear endgame, it almost always makes things worse. Now, I can already hear but if the US pulls back, won't our adversaries fill the void? To which they're already filling the void. Russia is in Syria, China is in Africa, and Iran is in Yemen. The question isn't whether they'll exert their influence, it's whether the US can afford to keep trying to counter them everywhere at once. The answer is no. And the George Washington incident proves it. Here's another uncomfortable: the US is no longer the sole arbiter of global security. The world is moving toward a multipolar order, whether Washington likes it or not. And in that order, the US will have to accept that it can't dictate outcomes, it can only shape them. That means working with allies when possible, deterring adversaries when necessary, and, above all, avoiding the kind of overreach that leads to strategic blunders like the one we just saw in Venezuela. So what does this look like in practice? It means accepting that some conflicts, like the one in Ukraine, are existential for our allies but not for us. It means recognizing that China's rise isn't something the US can stop, only manage. And it means understanding that the era of American hegemony is over, and that the sooner Washington accepts that, the better off it and the world will be. The final pillar of my prescription is economic statecraft over military coercion. The US still has the world's largest economy, the most dynamic financial system, and the dollar's privileged status as the global reserve currency. But instead of leveraging these strengths, Washington keeps defaulting to military solutions. Sanctions, for all their flaws, are still a more effective tool than carrier deployments when used judiciously. The problem is that the US has overused them to the point of diminishing returns. When you sanction half the world, you're not just punishing your enemies, you're pushing them to build alternatives. And that's exactly what's happening. Russia and China are developing their own payment systems. The BRICS nations are trading in local currencies. And even US allies are starting to hedge their bets. The George Washington incident should be a wake-up call. Not because it was a military defeat, it wasn't, but because it exposed the limits of American power in a world that no longer bends to Washington's will. The US can still be a great power, but it can't be the only great power. And the sooner it accepts that, the sooner it can start playing a smarter, more sustainable game. Because here's the alternative isn't pretty. If the US keeps overreaching, it won't just lose influence, it will lose credibility. And in geopolitics, credibility is everything. Once your adversaries stop believing in your resolve, once your allies start doubting your commitments, once your own people question the cost of empire, then you're not just in decline. You're in freefall. And that's a future none of us should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that the George Washington fiasco wasn't just a foreign policy embarrassment, it was a domestic political earthquake waiting to happen. And in Venezuela, the aftershocks are already being felt in ways that could reshape the country's future far more than any U.S. carrier ever could. Let me explain why this matters. For years, the Maduro government has survived on a simple blame all of Venezuela's problems on American imperialism. It's a narrative that works because, for most of the 21st century, it hasn't been entirely false. The U.S. has sanctioned Venezuela relentlessly, first under Obama, then escalated under Trump, and maintained under Biden. The 2019 recognition of Juan Guaido as interim president was a textbook example of Washington overreach, a gambit that backfired spectacularly when the opposition failed to unify and the military refused to defect. But here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime has always needed the U.S. as an enemy to justify its own failures. The George Washington incident handed him the perfect gift, a concrete, humiliating example of American weakness that he can use to rally support at home. I've spoken to sources in Caracas who tell me that the government's propaganda machine is already in overdrive. State media is framing the carrier's withdrawal as a historic victory, proof that Venezuela can stand up to the Yankee Empire. And it's working. Polls from Dataanalysis, one of the few remaining credible firms in the country, show a temporary bump in Maduro's approval ratings, nothing dramatic, but enough to shift the narrative. More importantly, it's giving the regime cover to crack down on dissent. In the weeks following the incident, there's been a noticeable uptick in arbitrary detentions, particularly targeting opposition figures and journalists who've been critical of the government's handling of the crisis. The message is: if the U.S. can't even project power off our coast, what makes you think they'll protect you? But here's where things get complicated. The George Washington debacle isn't just a win for Maduro, it's a double-edged sword. Because while it shores up his domestic legitimacy in the short term, it also exposes the fragility of his international position. Venezuela's economy is still in shambles. Inflation, though down from its 2018 peak of over 1 million%, remains stubbornly high at around 200% annually. Oil production, the lifeblood of the economy, has flatlined at just over 700,000 barrels per day, less than a third of what it was under Chavez. And despite the recent easing of some U.S. sanctions, foreign investment is still a trickle. The problem for Maduro is that his survival has always depended on two: repression at home and external patrons abroad. The first is still working, but the second is getting harder to maintain. Russia and China, Venezuela's two main backers, are growing impatient. Moscow has propped up Maduro with loans, military support, and oil deals, but with the war in Ukraine draining its resources, it can't afford to keep writing blank checks. China, meanwhile, has been more cautious. Beijing has invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, but it's also hedged its bets by cultivating relationships with opposition figures. The Chinese aren't ideological, they're pragmatic. And right now, they're waiting to see which way the wind blows. Which brings us to the most dangerous of Venezuela that's neither fully aligned with the West nor fully under the thumb of its authoritarian patrons. A Venezuela that's adrift. This is the nightmare scenario for U.S. policymakers, because a failed state in the Caribbean isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it's a geopolitical black hole. We've seen this movie before. In the 1990s, Haiti's collapse led to a refugee crisis that destabilized Florida. In the 2000s, Somalia's chaos became a haven for pirates and terrorists. Venezuela is bigger, richer in resources, and far more strategically located. If Maduro's regime collapses, or worse, if it survives but the country fractures, we could be looking at a migration crisis that makes the current situation at the U.S. southern border look like a warm-up act. Here's the US has no good options here. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed. The Biden administration's attempts at engagement have been half-hearted at best. And now, after the George Washington incident, the political space for a negotiated solution is shrinking. The Venezuelan opposition is more divided than ever. Guaido's star has faded, and the new generation of leaders, people like Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary in 2023, are either in exile or under house arrest. The military, the real power broker in Venezuela, is still firmly behind Maduro, but cracks are starting to show. In 2023, there were at least 3 reported coup attempts, all of which were quickly suppressed. But in a country where the economy is still on life support, it's only a matter of time before the next crisis hits. So what happens next? I see 3 possible scenarios, none of them pretty. The first is a slow-motion collapse, where Maduro clings to power but the country continues to deteriorate. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. The regime will tighten its grip, the opposition will fracture further, and the international community will grow increasingly indifferent. The second scenario is a negotiated transition, where Maduro cuts a deal to step down in exchange for immunity and a share of power for his cronies. This is what the US has been pushing for, but it's a long shot. Maduro has seen what happens to dictators who give up power, just ask Hosni Mubarak or Omar al-Bashir. The third scenario is a violent rupture, a coup, a civil war, or a sudden regime collapse. This is the least likely but most dangerous outcome, because it would trigger a regional crisis that could draw in Colombia, Brazil, and even the US. The George Washington incident didn't cause any of these scenarios, but it did accelerate them. By exposing the limits of American power, it's given Maduro more room to maneuver, but it's also forced him to rely even more on his dwindling circle of supporters. And that's a recipe for instability. Because in Venezuela, as in so many other places, the real danger isn't that the US will intervene too much, it's that it won't intervene at all. And when great powers disengage, the vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. It gets filled by the worst kind of warlords, criminals, and opportunists who thrive in chaos. This is the lesson Washington still refuses to learn. The era of American hegemony is over, but that doesn't mean the US can afford to disengage. It means the opposite. In a multipolar world, the US needs to pick its battles carefully, but it also needs to be present in the places that matter. Venezuela matters. Not because it's a threat to US security, it isn't, but because its collapse would have consequences that ripple far beyond its borders. And yet, after the George Washington fiasco, the political will to do anything about it is evaporating. Here's the final: the same people in Washington who pushed for the carrier deployment are now using its failure as an excuse to wash their hands of Venezuela entirely. They'll say it's not our problem, that we've tried and failed, that we should focus on great power competition instead. But that's not strategy, that's surrender. And in geopolitics, surrender has a way of coming back to haunt you. Just ask the British after Suez, or the Soviets after Afghanistan. The US can't afford to make the same mistake. Because if Venezuela falls apart, it won't just be Maduro's failure, it'll be ours too. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader unraveling of America's post-Cold War playbook. For 3 decades, Washington operated under the assumption that military power could be wielded like a precise, controlled, and always yielding the desired outcome. The George Washington incident shattered that illusion, not because the carrier was ineffective in absolute terms, but because it was deployed in a context where the rules of the game had already changed. The US still thinks in terms of deterrence, but Maduro's regime doesn't play by those rules. It plays by the rules of survival, and survival often means ignoring the costs until it's too late. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The real lesson here isn't that carriers are obsolete, far from it. It's that the US has forgotten how to use them as part of a coherent strategy rather than a blunt instrument. The George Washington was sent to Venezuela's doorstep in April 2023 as part of a so-called show of force after Maduro's government arrested 10 American oil executives on trumped-up espionage charges. The problem? The deployment was announced with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The Pentagon briefed reporters on the carrier's movements, the State Department issued a statement condemning Maduro's provocations, and the White House made sure the world knew this was a clear message to the regime. But here's the uncomfortable: in a country where the government's legitimacy is already hanging by a thread, public threats don't deter, they embolden. Maduro's response was predictable because it was scripted. He didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down, expelling the U.S. Embassy's remaining staff, arresting more opposition figures, and even staging a military exercise near the Colombian border, all while the George Washington loitered impotently off the coast. The regime's propaganda machine went into overdrive, framing the carrier as proof that the U.S. was plotting an invasion, which, of course, it wasn't. But perception is reality in politics, and Maduro's base, already paranoid and isolated, rallied around the flag. The irony? The very deployment meant to weaken him ended up giving him a lifeline. Here's where the grand strategy failure becomes glaring. The U.S. has two broad options in Venezuela, neither of which it's pursuing with any consistency. The first is accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and focus on mitigating the fallout. That means working with regional partners like Colombia and Brazil to manage migration flows, cracking down on illicit gold and cocaine trafficking, and using targeted sanctions to limit the regime's access to hard currency. It's not pretty, but it's realistic. The second option is regime change, but not the kind Washington tried in 2019, when it recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president and expected the military to flip. That was a gamble, and it failed because the U.S. overestimated its leverage. A smarter approach would involve quietly supporting opposition factions, pressuring Cuba and Russia to reduce their support for Maduro, and preparing for the day when the regime's internal fractures become unmanageable. Neither of these strategies is being executed with any seriousness, because the political appetite for either has vanished. The George Washington fiasco didn't just expose the limits of American power, it revealed the bankruptcy of American thinking. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a distraction from the real China in the Indo-Pacific, Russia in Europe, and the looming threat of a second Trump presidency. But that's a false choice. The U.S. doesn't have to choose between great power competition and regional stability, it has to recognize that the two are intertwined. Venezuela's collapse would send shockwaves through Latin America, a region where China has already made significant inroads. Beijing isn't just buying Venezuelan oil at a discount, it's embedding itself in the country's infrastructure, telecommunications, and even its military. If Maduro falls, China stands to lose billions in loans and investments, which means it has every incentive to prop him up. The U.S. can't afford to ignore that dynamic, because every dollar China spends in Venezuela is a dollar it's not spending in the South China Sea. Let's talk about alternatives, because there are still moves left on the board. The first is to stop treating Venezuela as a monolith. The regime isn't a single entity, it's a coalition of factions, some of which are more pragmatic than others. The U.S. should be quietly engaging with those factions, offering incentives for defection. That's how the Soviet Union collapsed, after not through military pressure, but through the slow erosion of elite loyalty. The second is to work with Europe to create a viable off-ramp for Maduro. The EU has been more willing to engage with the regime than the US, and it could play a role in negotiating a transition that avoids total chaos. The third is to prepare for the worst. If Venezuela implodes, the US needs a plan to stabilize the country, one that doesn't involve another Iraq-style occupation but does involve working with regional partners to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. Here's the thing about the bill always comes due. The US can ignore Venezuela now, but it won't be able to ignore the consequences later. The migration crisis will worsen, the drug trade will EXD, and the power vacuum will be filled by actors even more hostile to American interests. That's not alarmism, it's history. Look at what happened in Syria after the US pulled back. Look at what's happening in Haiti right now. The lesson is disengagement doesn't prevent chaos, it accelerates it. I'll leave you with this. In 1961, the Kennedy administration launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, a botched operation that humiliated the U.S. and strengthened Castro's regime. The failure didn't lead to disengagement, it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The U.S. learned the hard way that miscalculations in the Caribbean have global consequences. 60 years later, we're making the same mistake in Venezuela, but with less urgency and even less strategy. The George Washington incident wasn't just a tactical error, it was a symptom of a deeper problem. America's foreign policy establishment is still operating on autopilot, deploying tools from the last century in a world that's moved on. And until that changes, we'll keep getting the same failure, followed by retreat, followed by regret.